Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, welcome to BungaCast. Welcome all potentially 8 billion of you. Many of you screaming shitbags, but also many humans very capable and creative, able to produce and even change the very conditions that make their life possible. So, humans on balance, pretty good. What do you think, George?
You're talking about normal people, though. You're not talking about podcasters.
No,
also this is
we are
the topic of the
just screaming
discussion.
shitbags. We are screaming shitbags exclusively.
You can't say this is the conclusion and then let's have a discussion about it. This is what we need to decide over the course of debate and argumentation and all these other kind of human activities. So, but yeah, humans in general, I'd say I'm a fan. Yeah.
Good. I think that's a wholesome starting point. Today, we're actually very much on the topic going to be talking about proposals for degrowth. Phil.
Yeah. So this has been floating around for a while, and you can trace back some of this degrowth thing. You can trace back to Club of Rome stuff in the 1970s, and obviously also one of the criticisms of the degrowth stuff is that it has its roots back in Thomas Malthus himself, so prior to the Industrial Revolution.
Tell us what the Club of Rome is.
Yeah, the Club of Rome. So this was a kind of one of the early kind of proto networks that developed in the 1970s alongside fora like the G7, among others, and it was supported by the Ford Foundation. And it put together a vision of why diminishing resources and population explosion meant that there had to be restraints to what people could expect, and that if there was to be, if there was to be any redistribution, it would have to come from a static pool of resources and wealth, essentially. So the Club of Rome kind of was emblazoned a certain vision of stasis, essentially economic stasis as a result of environmental limits and stresses. And so many, all this discussion in the post-war period, at least, always circles back to the Club of Rome. So all that said, though, the point is, right, the reason we're talking about it is because it seems to be back in the air in a very particular way, and especially on the left. And there's also been an influential, alongside these discussions of degrowth, which have been floating around kind of green circles, I suppose, for a long time. There's also an influential strain of eco-Marxism that has been around for a while, and it's associated principally with the work of the late Mike Davis, but especially John Bellamy Foster. And though that the vision of eco-Marxism is broader than degrowth, there is a renewed interest in degrowth specifically. And I suppose some of the most prominent figures associated with this would be Jason Hickel, for those in social media, Kohei Saito, a Japanese Marxist who's just released a book on degrowth, which has apparently sold tremendously well in Japan and is making through in an English translation shortly, and also Andreas Malm's work, and in particular his idea of the Bolshevik model of war communism as the paradigm for the green transition to today. And listeners might recall we discussed both Malm's book, and we also had Malm on as a guest in episode 168. So before we get more into maybe some of the specific flexes around degrowth at the moment, I wondered, how do you guys understand degrowth, and when did you encounter the idea?
Yeah, so I guess degrowth, it sort of seems to me like you have the less growth and then the less importance of growth, different sorts of ways of doing it. So you have kind of growth isn't worth it. We need to kind of shrink our economies. You have like people saying that, and which is true, that capitalism produces irrationally. So, you could reorder production and decrease it. And then you have I guess it's somewhat aligned. We put too much importance on growth instead of GDP. Let's have a kind of happiness index or something like that. And I guess first encountering this idea, and it's probably changed a lot since then. This would have been like the noughties, late noughties, probably, very much associated with environmentalism. And it wasn't so much of a thing then, but the Optimum Population Trust, which I think David Attenborough's the patron of, that kind of environmentalism that sees humans as like essentially like threats to the true, the nice, the natural world. So yeah, I guess it's been around for a little while, but it definitely wasn't as big a thing in the noughties as it is today. It didn't have the same sort of intellectual.
So when did you first encounter it?
Yeah, like late noughties probably. I can't remember it wasn't like I wasn't first looking on Chapman's Homer where it was like, oh, this thing, it's now imprinted on my mind the first time I ever saw it. But yeah, probably around that time. And I don't really remember though. It's obviously read Malthus and all that sort of thing seriously again, maybe in probably late noughties.
I wonder if it was partly mainstreamed. I remember there's that scene in the first Matrix where Agent Smith, played by Hugo Weaving, is tormenting or torturing Keanu Reeves, the hero in the first Matrix movie, and hero in all the movies. But anyway, and he says he says something like human beings are a virus on the planet. And that kind of idea of humans as a pestilence, essentially, pestilential kind of, or humans are the plague rather than the plague on humans. I think that was probably a moment in which it kind of packaged in that way, and the success of the Matrix movies, it probably articulated something that was already, in the air, and popularized and packaged up a particular view of humanity that had been bubbling away for a long time, in various kinds of eco and green and environmental ideas of humanity overburdening the planet. And then it was finally kind of thrust forward in this kind of fully misanthropic form and popularized in that film.
Yeah, I do remember going to the zoo and like there was this thing like the most dangerous animal in the world, and there was a cage, and you kind of like went around the corner and then you realized it was a mirror, and like it was humans, it was you who's the most dangerous animal in the world. And that was probably considerably earlier than my like other interaction with it. But yeah, I guess it's
Harambe would no doubt agree if he were still with us. So
yeah, I mean, R.I.P. Harambe. But
such a lame effort to be.
But come on, we're down with the kids. No, but this was obviously a little bit earlier. I think that you're right though. There was a point in which it became a more fully realized philosophy than just some kind of residual, more kind of environmentalist, kind of communal garden anti-humanism.
I'm not sure I would say the Matrix movies were a fully developed philosophy, but I don't know, maybe. I mean, obviously, maybe you use the Matrix in teaching. You're one of those cool philosopher tutors who would offer your students the red pill and the blue pill, George. I don't know.
I mean, sitting on the table is a classic teaching move. And it's I was going to say it's underused. Maybe it's not underused anymore. No, I was never a cool teacher. I was, if it's 1 minute late, it's late. You get 0 marks and I'm not going to read it sort of teacher, which is probably why I don't think many of my ex-students are particularly sad I'm not doing that anymore. But anyway, Alex, I think you were going to contribute something a bit more.
No, I mean, I agree with you in terms of, the sort of vague kind of nihilistic vibes that were in the air and transmitted into cultural product, an environment, kind of certain deep green ideas. And I remember kind of writing and thinking and arguing a lot about this around the late 2000s, especially before the global financial crisis, or maybe in that period shortly after, before it it kind of came to consciousness that this meant things had significantly changed, and so it was all around then. But I only encountered degrowth as a kind of more structured sort of idea and proposal in a more mainstream fashion relatively recently. I mean, I think we, on this podcast, we've remarked, in trying to kind of, periodize the present, trying to kind of understand our place in recent history, that, that the 2000s were, especially in Britain, I mean, was very much dominated by environmentalism and environmental claims at that time, or in the most kind of lightweight, superficial way possible. So it was all about kind of recycling, taking green bags, whatever stuff that the same type of people today actually satirize and criticize as being completely superficial. Right. So back then it was all this kind of like little happy clappy initiatives for how to save the planet. And now those same people are basically treat those sort of practices as completely, unsatisfactory, or even, explicitly as like capitalist ideology. And instead we need to be degrowth. So there's a certain kind of like radicalization there, as well as a mainstreaming at the same time. So yeah, anyways, as a way of trying to a little bit like clean up my understanding of what degrowth is now in terms of its proposal, I've tried to kind of break it down in terms of its different claims. And I mean, I haven't done an exhaustive, kind of research of all degrowth claims, but just reading a couple of things where they argue for degrowth. I think we can categorize it a bit, and guys, jump in obviously if you think something's missing or I've mischaracterized something. But so firstly, in environmental terms, I think there's a kind of strict approach in terms of degrowth is necessary to decarbonize, to reduce carbon emissions. And then there's a kind of wider environmental claim, which is really about saving the planet in broad sense. It's about finite resources, about pollution, about extinction of species, and indeed of humans. So there's kind of, a kind of narrow claim on environmental terms and a wider one. Socially, there's an anti-consumerist angle, basically the idea that there's too much stuff and that we need to degrow the economy because we're filling up the world with crap, which obviously has its environmental repercussions, but it's also a claim about, human sociability, that, that people are going after consumer goods, wanting SUVs and wanting, little consumer baubles and whatever, instead of focusing on what matters. And there's a kind of second claim very closely related to that, also on the social terrain, which is, I classed it kind of here as decelerationist, but basically it says that, we should focus on the things that matter. Degrowth would allow us to have more peace, more free time, more meaningful lives dedicated to meeting meaningful pursuits, rather than the infinite growth of where we're constantly pursuing more production, more consumer goods, more of everything. And instead we can make do with less and have a more meaningful, connected social existence. It's effectively breaking away from the infernal machine that is capitalism. That at least that's how it's presented. There's a set of like economic claims, which I think we've already hinted at, but one is focused on well-being, which says, GDP is a poor measure of well-being, which is well-trodden ground by now. Even kind of in the mainstream economic discussions, and that instead we should degrow because we can focus on, welfare, effectively, on well-being, on the goods that are essential or most important, and not pursue ever-expanding growth. And then following on from that, there's a claim, I think, which is basically redistribution is more important than production. We can stop production. We can stop producing ever more, stop going after growth, and instead effectively settle accounts. So if we redistribute the present, we redistribute all the wealth that there is now, we'll be far better off. And that obviously has a claim at a level of the nation state, so there can be redistribution to a kind of median level within the nation state or globally even. And that, certainly the left-wing degrowth argument is very much premised on that. Stop growth and have equality instead. And then there's some philosophical claims, which is basically, one is basically the cancer metaphor, that basically eternal growth is impossible. It logically makes no sense. The logic of ever continuing growth is the logic of cancer. It's a metastasizing society, and therefore something which is, evil, damaging, impossible, etc. And then associated with that is the general kind of apocalyptic Malthusianism, which we've already kind of referenced, that the world is going to completely burn up. There's limits to growth. It's impossible to continue and infinitely expanding. And this is at a kind of a level of abstraction beyond just the kind of specific environmental or economic claims. Now, okay, so those are like four categories: environmental, social, economic, and philosophical. notably, I haven't mentioned political, and I think partly because degrowth doesn't seem to have a very strong political claim, which might be a problem. What is its understanding of politics? Maybe that growth, empowers the already powerful, right? That it's capitalists who want growth because they make more money off of it, and it's not good for us, but that perpetuates the power system that exists. At most, I think that's its political claim. Ultimately, in the absence of any real politics, it defaults to emergency politics. It defaults to basically anything goes because, we have to get off the growth train immediately for all these environmental reasons, as well as the social and economic ones. And therefore, it needs to avail itself of claims about emergency, and therefore everything is possible or everything is permitted in pursuit of pulling the handbrake there. Hey there, you've reached the end of a short excerpt from an episode that's been released only to our patrons. If you'd like to join us and gain access to around 2 Patreon exclusive episodes a month, please go to patreon.com/bungacast. We'd love to have you.